All right. Now I'm going to try a technological feat that hopefully the gods will not be angry at me about. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to play a video for you of one of those Center of Medical Progress's videos that both David and Ed had referred to. So give me a moment and I'm going to attempt to do that. Now, hopefully you can see my browser with the video open. I don't know that I can make this full screen without it going to YouTube. I actually want the video to play through the Center for Medical Progress's website as opposed to YouTube, so we don't get all of the stuff on YouTube. And I've shared my sound, so hopefully everyone can hear the video. So by the way, this video is of, she is Dr. Mary Gowder, and she is the president, or at the time was the president of Planned Parenthood's Medical Directors Council.
Hello, I'm Cecile Richards, president of Planned Parenthood Federation of America. I want to be really clear. The allegation that Planned Parenthood profits in any way from tissue donation is not true.
What would you expect for intact tissue? What sort of compensation? What sort of...
Well, why don't you start by telling me what you're used to paying?
We'll be exhibiting at the Medical Directors Council meeting in a couple of weeks, so I don't know if you'll be attending.
I'm now the president of that organization.
Oh.
So we had just started the conversation. This is they're a startup that they have been about a year in business. They're a for-profit company that's connecting researchers with people willing to donate tissue. Our volume, thank you for giving it to me, is 800 a year with 60 in the second trimester. And we just started to talk about how the process worked with Novogenics down in Los Angeles when I was there. Back up a little bit. PPFA, our parent body, is on board with donation, but we have to ask for a waiver to do it, and we have to lay out for them what our program's going to be like. And the mechanics of it was that Heather, a Novogenics person, would come to the site, and our staff would sign the patients up and get consent, and then Heather would look at the tissue and take what she required. So it was logistically very easy for us. We didn't have to do anything. So there was compensation for this, and we didn't have to do anything. So there was compensation for this, and there was a discussion as I was leaving. They had been paying by the case, and there was some discussion about doing it in a different way, or I don't know what you're used to doing, how are you used to doing compensation. The patients don't get anything, of course. But.
Okay, so I'd like, what would you expect for intact tissue? What sort of compensation? What sort of...
Well, why don't you start by telling me what you're used to paying?
Okay. I don't think so. I would like to know what would make you happy. What would work for you?
Well, you know, in negotiations, the person who throws out the figure first is at a loss, right? So.
No, I don't look at it that way. I know you want to play that game. I get it, but no, I want
low ball because I'm used to low things from.
You know what? If you low ball, I'll act pleasantly surprised, and you'll know it's a low ball.
Okay.
What I want to know is what would work for you. Don't low ball it.
Okay.
Tell me what you really.
$75 a specimen.
Oh, that's way too low. And that's really that's way too low. I want to keep you happy.
I've been at places that did 50 too. But see, we don't. we're not in it for the money, but why don't you start and tell me what you're used to paying?
Oh,
Because I just don't want to
no, I want
lowball
you
$75 a specimen. And we don't want to be in the position of being accused of selling tissue and stuff like that. On the other hand, there are costs associated with the use of our space
Exactly.
and all that kind of stuff. So what would you
Yes.
think about it?
Right. So, way higher than that. So I'd like to start at around 100.
Okay. Now this is for tissue that you actually take, not just the tissue that the person volunteered that you can't find anything. Right?
Exactly.
Now this is for tissue that you actually take, not just the tissue that the person volunteered that you can't find anything. Right?
Exactly. Right. What we can use, what is intact. So that's why I'm saying no, don't lowball. I want you to be happy.
It's complicated by the fact that our volume is so low too. I mean, are you looking at 8 and 9 week specimens or only second trimester specimens?
10 to 12 week, end of the first trimester. If those are pretty intact specimens, then that's something we can work with.
So that's an interesting concept. Let me explain to you a little bit of a problem, which may not be a big problem. If our usual technique is suction at 10 to 12 weeks, and we switch to using an iPass or something with less suction or to increase the odds that will come out as an intact specimen, then we're kind of violating the protocol that says to the patient, we're not doing anything different in our care of you. And to me, that's a kind of a specious little argument, and I wouldn't object to asking Ian, who's our surgeon who does the cases, to use an iPass at that gestational age in order to increase the odds that he was going to get an intact specimen. But I do need to throw it out there as a concern because the patient is signing something and we're signing something saying we're not changing anything in the way we're managing you just because you agreed to give tissue. I've heard of that before.
Right. Yeah. No. It's definitely.
It's touchy. Okay. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think they're both totally appropriate techniques. There's no additional pain involved. I don't think the patients would care one iota. So I'm not making a fuss about that.
Okay.
Now you have my email address, right?
Got your email, yeah.
Okay. Write me a 3 to 4 paragraph proposal, which I will then take to Laurel and others in our organization to see if we want to pursue this. And then if we want to pursue this mutually, I'll mention this to Ian in terms of how he feels about using a less crunchy technique to get more whole specimens. And then if we agree to move forward, the next steps I need to apply to PPFA for a waiver to permit us to do this. We have to have a contract. Do you have a contract already?
We have what we've used in the past is a materials transfer agreement. And that's obviously open to discussion.
So that's a prototype. It needs to say exactly what your staff is going to do, exactly what your expectations are, exactly what your compensation is.
And are we agreed that $100 would keep you happy?
Well, let me agree to find out from other affiliates in California what they're getting. And if they're getting substantially more, then we can discuss it again.
Yes.
But the money is not the important thing.
No,
It has to be big enough that it's
But
worthwhile.
it is something to talk about. I mean, it's one of the first things that you brought up, right? So,
It has to be big enough that it's worthwhile.
but it is something to talk about. I mean, it's one of the first things that you brought up, right? So.
Now here's another thought: is we can talk about specimen as per specimen per case, or per procured tissue sample, which would be so if we're able to get a liver thymus pair, maybe that is $75 per specimen, and so that's for for liver thymus pair, and that's $150, versus if we can get liver thymus, brain hemisphere, and all that, then and then so that protects us so that we're not paying for what we can't use. I think it also maybe illustrates things.
It's been years since I talked about compensation, so let me just figure out what others are getting, and if this is in the ballpark, then that's fine. If it's still low, then we can talk about it. I want a Lamborghini. I said I want a Lamborghini.
Don't we all, right?
Yeah, exactly.
All right, hopefully everybody could hear that. All right. I'm going to switch over and okay. And so I thought at this point that David and Ed, I could have them, we could have a little bit of a discussion time just to change things up from lecture format a little bit. Except I think a lot of the things that you guys covered in the beginning actually were covered here. They even put up some of those regulations. And I guess one of the questions that came to my mind when and you know, this is the journalist question in me is like, okay, you know, some people are asking in their head, is this even legal? Is this legal? And I don't know if one of you, if Ed or David, you had.
I was just wondering how many potential violations of statute could you see in this little clip?
Good. It's a good law school exercise, you know, to spot the issues here. Yeah, I think the key thing to start with is when you see a conversation like this and then put it in the context of some of the things we talked about this morning, I just want to drive home that the reality here is there's an economy in fetal tissue, which if you go back to, you know, the report of the Adams panel or look at the, you know, the regulation, the statute that was enacted in 1993, it really doesn't address this at all. And again, I don't mean to keep harping back to the same point, but we have an economy in fetal tissue. And I think, you know, David's experience, albeit too brief, on the ethics advisory panel with NIH on this subject shows that even in the wake of the, you know, all this exposure and some criminal referrals and, you know, the prosecution of one entity out in California, this still goes on. You know, I'm not saying necessarily conversations like what we just had, but sloppiness in failing to, I mean, we just saw sort of the tip of the iceberg, sort of the transactional aspect of this. And, you know, you can argue till the cows come home whether $100 per specimen, if that's what they wind up with, is it just covers expenses, or it's hard to figure out what the expenses would be, since, you know, the technicians are doing all the, you know, so that's kind of hard to figure out what their expenses are. And even if, you know, given the vast millions of dollars, including taxpayers' funds that run through Planned Parenthood every year, this is certainly not but they're not giving it away for free. I mean, they're charging something, and, you know, that's part of the whole economy here. And at the bottom line of the economy, to go, you know, at the base of the economy, the base of the pyramid, if you will, is an abortive woman who, as you know, I emphasized earlier, is you know, very likely to be underprivileged and you know, and maybe seriously underprivileged, or maybe underprivileged in several ways, including not an insignificant number being involved in abusive relationships, et cetera. So, and maybe their own consent for the abortion is very compromised by those circumstances. So it might be, you know, in many cases, as we know from testimonies, is under duress. So, you know, that's what we're dealing with. I mean, I don't mean to negate the whole question of whether fetal body parts are being sold. That's very important, and I think that the videos demonstrate that there's at least you know, they're at least open to that, and here it seems like they're conspiring in some way to, you know, to do that. But, you know, look at the larger issue of you know, we have an economy here, and frankly, even if the stuff was being given away for free, the regulations aren't adequate to deal with that. Yeah. So that's, yeah. So again, I don't want to get, were there legal violations? I mean, clearly we're talking about, you know, let's see what other people are getting. Well, that has nothing to do with, you know, what other people are getting has nothing to do with what your costs are, what your expenses are for allowing this group to come in and select the fetal tissue. There's no connection between those two things. It's what is the market? I mean, they're saying they want to set the market. You know, it's like the current real estate. You know, let's go get the comps. It's like the current real estate market. I'm trying to sell my
check the comps.
father's house. I mean, what are the comps? I'm sorry, I talked for a while, David, but there you go.
No, exactly that. And you know, valuable consideration. Obviously, you're not just dealing with your own expenses. If you want to see what somebody else is getting, or you're trying to find out what you have paid before, you should already know, well, I've got a certain technician cost and storage cost or shipping cost and so on. But you know, as you pointed out in the things you were talking about before, a lot of these middlemen actually have their techs embedded in the clinic.
Yeah, sure.
So that's not an expense for them.
No, it isn't.
It's something borne by the middlemen, and of course they get an upcharge, shall we say. But you know, just at the level of the clinic, there's not a lot in terms of an expense. And the 93 statute is simply inadequate in terms of that sort of protection. Right. Another thing here, she kind of flew by it quickly, but talked about using a slightly different technique. Yes. And at one point called it a less crunchy technique. There's another video in this series that is rather more graphic, shall we say, in terms of later gestational age fetuses. But you know, it's again a matter of you're altering the procedure to be able to get more pristine specimens or be able to get more specimens and so on. There's this point about economy. They're ordering certain body parts. Yeah. They mentioned liver and thymus pairs, and we'll talk later on when we talk about the science why they're focused on that. But at one point, the House Select panel found one website where it basically had a drop-down box where you could pick what part you wanted and how many, kind of like going to Amazon and ordering so many things. You know, that's obviously not a matter of valuable consideration and ethical consideration. There's another point in here that we haven't really even brought up to a great extent, but we keep talking about informed consent, but is it even possible for the woman to give consent? I mean, there have been a number of people who've discussed how she can't actually provide consent because she is complicit in some way with the death of her child. And it's, you know, the more easily understood thing would be the stories about the Chinese who are selling prisoners' body parts before they're executed, and then they've got, you know, the technician there to harvest the body parts for transplant. But there's a similar sort of strain here about, can you even get adequate consent, well, let alone informed consent? And we talked about all of the misleading statements in, for example, the one informed consent form. And, you know, in terms of that economy, and Ed brought this up before, what if somehow they came up with something that was a cure or a treatment successfully using fetal tissue? Do you think that they would still be relying on just these middlemen, or would there be a gold rush, if you will, trying to encourage more abortions and more fetal tissue harvests? There's just a lot of things wrong, not just with this video, but with the whole industry, if you will.
So I was going to bring up really quick, just to give a little bit of some other perspective, I know of a couple of journalists or a couple of writers who maybe don't have a problem with abortion per se, but really had an issue with this just tangled conflict of interest that these videos show. So I've, some of these people that maybe think that abortion is okay, they're
Yeah.
for the woman, or focus on the woman as the patient. And then when these videos came out, several of them wrote about, well, this is obviously several conflicts of interest going on here. And they had a real problem with that. I think the organ donate or organ transplantation example that you brought up kind of hits on that that sense there, that there's too big of a knot here that is causing a problem.
I think was it Sarah Cliff in Vox?
I think it was in Vox.
Yeah, it was on Vox. Yeah, she, I watched the videos, and it was a pretty fair assessment that there's really some problems here.
Yeah.
So one of the questions that I had when I was thinking about that conflict of interest was, and while you guys were talking, so there's federal regulations on research, and I was thinking about, okay, well, there's federal grants, then there's research being done in public universities, and then research done in private universities. And I was just wondering, these brokers, are they representing researchers in public universities, state schools? And how does that play into regulations? Because, I think the panel that David was on, they were looking at NIH grants. But, there's other research going on from other grant institutions, but they might be going on at a state university. And I was thinking about who these brokers represent, and what universities are doing this research, and whether that counts as federal or not, and that kind of thing.
And I think the answer is they basically market, and I'm using that term intentionally. They market their tissue as middlemen to anyone who wants to buy it. So Advanced Bioscience Research was procuring and then passing on, if you will, tissue to the FDA. And there's evidence for some NIH intramural grants, but they've got basically the order sheets. Select panel dug very deep and found these sorts of order sheets where ABR was also marketing to public as well as private universities, NIH grants, state grants, and so on. So it's kind of just it is, again, I think Ed pegged it right. It's an economy. It's an industry, if you will. And that despite, we've talked a little bit about how it's a very small amount of taxpayer money and a very small percentage of grants, but there is an ingrained, if you will, group who they are committed to. They want to use fetal tissue from elective abortion. They're not interested in the alternatives. They're set on that particular tissue source, and we can talk later about why some of those reasons may be.
Well, I think at the root of all this, and the objection, going back, something we covered a couple minutes ago, the objection about the woman being the appropriate person to give consent was raised by the 4 dissenters on the Adams panel in 1988 and brushed aside. So I think I, briefly put up on a prior slide that the woman still has an interest somehow in well, we don't preclude organ donations if the deceased met their demise because of a homicide. But we don't have the person who, let's say, horribly, tragically, the homicide was intrafamilial. We don't have the family member who's guilty of the homicide involved in the decision whether to give consent for the donation of the tissue. I mean, that be the clearest example I can come up with in an analogous situation. And the person would obviously be excluded from any consideration. So I think that's just an ethical dodge. It really, she has an interest. What does that mean? She somehow has an interest. Well, maybe she does, but so maybe does the person who's committed matricide or patricide or any other interfamilial homicide. So that's just the kind of dodge that goes on. And I think at the basic root of all of this is that certainly for some of the, if you just take a step back, I mean, what is Planned Parenthood's interest here? Let's say, they don't need the money. I mean, we all know that they don't need the money. So why come out so, fire and brimstone against these videos? And, you can debate about whether stuff was edited or not, but the woman said what she said. I mean, investigators, I mean, if that rule were applied, 60 Minutes would have been out of business 50 years ago. Edited tapes, edited interviews and stuff left on the floor and all that. I mean, that's what TV journalism does. And this is a, modern form of TV journalism. You can like it or not like it. I'm kind of not my favorite form of journalism, but, she said what she said, and there's extended discussions here, including the bit about let's go get the comps. So, that's pretty damning. But what else is their interest here? I mean, they don't need the money. And, they don't really have, they're not a biomedical research company. They're not, for all the talk about all this, they treat the whole woman and all their health concerns and all that. They're basically into family planning, including family planning abortions. I mean, that's their thing. That's what they do. And so they really don't have any rooting interest or financial interest or any other interest in the results of this research. So why come after this so long and why be involved in this? Well, I think what is going on here at base, not everybody who supports this or everybody who finds it ethically acceptable, but certainly for certain people, this helps to validate the ethical permissibility of widespread abortion. I mean, it just does. We can get a benefit from this. So therefore, and that's something they can kind of hang on to. Anything that normalizes abortion. Remember, you have to, in this country, it's unlike other countries. We have a much wider, it's kind of ironic. We have a much wider open abortion scheme of law, legality of abortion than, say, virtually every other country in Europe. They have more age restrictions, more limitations, et cetera, for the most part in Europe. But abortion is not a politically or ethically controversial issue. The abortion rates tend to be lower and most, and all of that, but they tend to be, of course, a lot of that is because they didn't have a Roe versus Wade and all the politics, and they're different demographically, religiously, and all that. There's a lot of reasons for that. But in this country where abortion is, the law is much more wide open and abortion rates are higher, it is still the case that abortion is not a mainstream part of medical practice. It's vast majority of abortions are done in specialized clinics where only abortions are, abortions and related things are performed. There's the percentage of physicians who perform abortions versus number of abortions performed is tiny. It's this segregated thing. I've taught medical students for a long time. Again, it's Catholic medical school, so maybe that influences it, but take many people who, they or their colleagues are going to medical school to become an abortionist. I mean, it's not, it's just, it's a niche, that's probably not the best word to use, but that's what it is. And anything that brings it more into the mainstream is to Planned Parenthood's benefit. That's a long-winded way of saying that, but that's the.
Yeah, no,
I think that's part of
I'd
the
agree.
reality.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
so
short
sorry
phrase
for
that a lot
long
of people
speech, but I
use
think-
is to make something good come out of something bad.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
And I think you're exactly on point there, Ed, that it makes it look better.
Right.
I don't think anybody thinks it's a good thing.
Yeah.
They tend to be neutral at best. Although we've seen, this move more lately, celebratory, but for the most part, people just don't like it so much.
Yeah.
And then it comes down to, but is it legal? Well, yeah, but so there's sort of this grudging admittance. And if you can make that look even just a little bit better, you can make something good come out of it. In a sense, that consent form that we looked at and the claims for all these cure and so on was a very obviously exaggerated and misleading statement, but along those same lines. The woman sees that, and now she'll feel like, well, yeah, something good can come out of this. I don't feel good about it myself, but this will make me feel better. So
right.
So just to make a distinction, this is different from redeeming a bad situation. So,
right.
For example, adoption is a redemptive act, or even the case with the HeLa cells, where that those cells were obtained in a what we would consider an unethical manner, and that no one consented and that kind of thing. And redeeming that situation doesn't mean obtaining more, that we can just obtain more cells from other people without consent because we're going to redeem it later. So just to make a distinction between the Christian idea of redeeming a bad situation. That doesn't mean you then can go ahead and continue with this bad situation because there is some redemptive or some good that will come out of it.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, it looks like, so just going on our time here, if you guys have if David or Ed, if you have any additional things you want to say about the CMP videos, I will stop sharing my presentation and we will get into David's, the rest of the history and into kind of current research involving fetal tissue.
I just encourage people to take a look at some of the other videos. It just is very eye-opening. And I think it was sort of a watershed moment to bring it into the public eye. So it got wider discussion about the whole ethics of that market.
David, notwithstanding the court orders and the propensity of YouTube and others to take down things, are the videos generally still available?
I believe they're still available on the CMP website.
Okay, very good.
So that would be the first place to check. And there are a few other places, but
Yeah. Okay.
Okay,
I think David's up then, right? Yeah.
Yes, David is up, and I will put a link to the CMP website where I got that video. Okay, so in the chat, I will put a link to where I got the video that I showed all of you. And from there, you can navigate around that website to see the other videos.
Thanks, Heather. And thanks, Ed, too, for, really kind of exposing us to the ethical thought pattern, which, for the most part, I don't think people think that way. I don't think they've really spent much time thinking about it. I know as a scientist, we don't tend to think about ethics very much. We just want to do our experiments and so on. And I want to delve into some of these things about fetal tissue research, a little bit of history, and then we're going to flow on into what's currently going on and talk more about the alternatives, some of those things we teased you with at the beginning. Assuming I can make mine work. Here we go. So this is a fairly long history for using fetal tissue or trying to use fetal tissue. We might want to phrase it that way, especially for transplantation. The thought pattern goes like this. This is young tissue. And a lot of the diseases they would like to treat tend to be degenerative diseases. As we age, things start to break down, the warranty's out, and so on. But so the idea would be to use this fresh and particularly this young tissue to try and replace what has been lost. 1921, the first recorded episode of using fetal tissue to transplant. This was in the UK to try and treat Addison's disease. 1928, Italy to try and treat cancer. 39 to try and treat diabetes. There have been other transplant attempts for conditions like anemias, immune deficiencies. Pretty paltry results though. For example, between 1970 and 1991, about 1,500 people got fetal pancreatic tissue transplants in attempts to treat diabetes. As many as 24 fetuses, and their tissue that is, per transplant, that got less than 2% of patients to respond. Well, of course, we now have factory-grown, genetically engineered insulin that people can take. You don't need to try and transplant this tissue. There are other, even more modern ways to gain pancreatic, especially beta cells, to try and treat diabetes. Fetal tissue really didn't pan out very well in terms of transplants. Between 1960 and 1990, lots of attempts to transplant fetal liver, fetal thymus for lots of conditions. And this one review I came across said the clinical results and patient survival rates are largely dismal. Very little in the way of success and very little in the way, you might say, of encouragement to keep doing this, but they did. And so Ed and I have both mentioned how Parkinson's disease was a neurological condition they focused on. The idea of transplanting fetal brain tissue in the 80s, the early 90s, largely anecdotal, but that push led to overturning the moratorium by President Clinton and the fetal tissue statute, which, as you'll recall, is focused on research for transplantation, because the great hope was going to be transplanting this fetal tissue and curing people of all sorts of diseases. We'll come back in a little bit to how well that turned out, but the comment of some of the previous things is still there, largely dismal. Another kind of looking back before 2000, we should say, using fetal tissue to grow viruses and make vaccines. It's again the case that no fetal tissue has ever been used to produce or even create a vaccine, but they did use fetal tissue from abortion to grow poliovirus. 1936, Sabin used fetal tissue to try and grow poliovirus. 1949, Enders was the one who was really successful in lots of different types of fetal tissues, and in fact then got the Nobel Prize in 1954, but it wasn't for polio vaccine. It wasn't for any vaccine. There's this mantra that we've heard so often, really since David Daleidon's videos and the select panel, that Fetal tissue was used to create polio vaccine and has saved millions, even billions of lives around the world. The numbers kind of keep growing every time it's repeated, but fetal tissue wasn't used. And they'll point to Enders and being able to grow polio virus in fetal tissue and his Nobel Prize. But the Nobel Prize wasn't given for any vaccine. It was given for their discovery of the ability of poliomyelitis viruses to grow in cultures of various types of tissue, period. And in point of fact, the original Salk and Sabin vaccines didn't use fetal tissue. They used monkey tissue to grow the polio virus. So not even human tissue. But as we've mentioned before, and we'll come back to again in some detail later on, use of these cell lines. So again, derived from fetal tissue, but grown in the lab for decades now, and growing poliovirus in some of these cells in lab dishes, and then using that. In the 60s especially, this one cell line, WI38, was used to grow poliovirus and actually used for some vaccines, not for very many. This is one of the original papers by Hayflick and his co-workers where they found that they could grow not in fetal tissue, but in these fetal cell lines or cell strains in the lab, the poliovirus. Another rationale to use fetal tissue is to observe basic human development. And that one makes maybe more sense than some of the others. You want to know how we grow, how we develop, how the organs are formed at different stages of development. That's been an ongoing, even from early days, supposed rationale for using fetal tissue, developmental biology and embryology. For example, checking the lungs of aborted babies to see when certain enzymes form, in particular the ones that will help them survive once they're born. Checking brains to isolate cells and validate model systems later on to be used in the lab. Looking at cell differentiation at different points in development. Checking out immunity and infection. One more recent example, trying to use aborted fetal brain tissue to study Zika infection and figure out how it worked. I might point out, and we'll come back and talk about it later, it wasn't fetal tissue, though, that figured out the mechanism of Zika virus. It was one of those ethical alternatives. Back in 2015, Meredith Wadman, who at that point was writing for Nature, she's a science writer, she's now with the journal Science, put together this part of an article where she was looking at, for NIH-funded grants, where the money was going, what types of studies were being done. Notice that the biggest one has to do with HIV/AIDS, so studying infection, studying immunity. And in particular, most of that money at that point, and certainly since then, has gone for what are called humanized mice, putting a human immune system into a mouse to study it instead of studying people and infecting them. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But again, developmental biology studies, studying eye development, looking at other infectious diseases, and so on. The money has actually increased over the last few years that NIH is spending on fetal tissue research. Now, the numbers were taken before the Ethics Advisory Board met and made recommendations, and before the shutdown of the intramural research, but it's going to come out about that same amount, somewhere a little beyond 100 million taxpayer dollars, which, you know, in the grand scheme of things, isn't a lot of the NIH budget. For fiscal year 2014, it was less than 0.2% of the extramural grants. Add maybe another 20 million for the intramural research that was done with fetal tissue. It's still not a lot of money, but the amount of money really isn't the question here. The ethics as well as the practicality and efficacy of the research, I think are some of the main reasons. So it kind of gives us a background. There's been, you know, a fair history of attempts to use fetal tissue research, but not a great deal of success. So what I want to do is now let's come up to modern day, the last decade at most. And here are the main arguments that we keep hearing about why we still need fetal tissue from elective abortion. Well, it's legally obtained. I have rarely heard any sort of ethical justification. For most scientists, the science is their guide. And if it's legal, then it's ethical. If it's good science, then it's ethical. This one from a very prominent pro-fetal tissue researcher who participated on the ethics advisory board with me. Well, otherwise they just throw it away. You'd waste it. It's already led to major medical advances. This is where they will talk about the polio vaccine and various things, but the truth is it really hasn't. And we'll look at the failures in just a bit. And we'll look at humanized mice, which is sort of the big area for fetal tissue research now. I've heard people say if there were better alternatives, why we'd use them. We don't really enjoy using human fetal tissue research. In fact, this was a statement in front of the select panel. But there's nothing else. There are no alternatives. It's a flexible and less differentiated tissue, a very biological oriented one that if I want to be able to use it in lots of experiments, this is really where I want to go. It grows readily. It adapts to new environments, kind of some of the same reasons here. You can study basic biology because we can look at different gestational ages, or it has unique characteristics that can't be replicated with adult tissue. And this is, you know, we've got to have it. There is no substitute. This, again, no alternatives. So again, let's kind of look at the more recent results and uses of fetal tissue. We mentioned these Parkinson's patients. The first few experiments, mostly anecdotal. So NIH funded 2 large multi-million-dollar clinical trials where they were transplanting fetal brain tissue into Parkinson's patients. 2001, a clinical trial report made the front page of the New York Times, where the patients were described as writhing, twisting, jerking with uncontrollable movements, and the doctors themselves said it was absolutely devastating, tragic, catastrophic, and a real nightmare. These are the doctors that were running the clinical trial and had hoped for great things from fetal tissue. There were a few patients, the younger patients, who seemed to show some improvement or stabilization, might be a better way to put it. But the vast majority of the patients either showed no improvement or showed some of these adverse events. Second large clinical trial, 2003, over half of the patients developed these potentially disabling tremors. It made them worse, made their Parkinson's tremor worse. And Ed talked about how they went into a self-imposed moratorium. That came off, but so far those transplant experiments are only taking place in Europe, not in the US. And in fact, there's been no NIH funding for fetal tissue clinical trials since fiscal year 2003. A follow-up report from a previous funded trial didn't appear until 2009, where they were transplanting again fetal brain tissue into Huntington patients, and they described the one patient as developing, quotes, graft overgrowth. It's a nice euphemism for you've got a lot of stuff growing there that we don't know what it is. We usually would call it a tumor. We're not going to call it that here. What about alternatives? Well, one I'd like to point out is instead of using the organs from aborted infants, aborted babies, fetuses, actually do repair of their conditions within the womb. This is a huge area right now. So my colleagues wrote this paper, The Perinatal Revolution, where they just put together for the first time a look at all the various clinical practices where they're actually doing in utero surgery. You probably recognize this, this picture. It's been out there a long time. Little Samuel Armas, who's now in his 20s, but they were doing an in utero surgery for spina bifida. This is now a case where I think they've done at least 1,400 of these surgeries. The patients do so much better by doing the surgery at this point, which Samuel was about 19 weeks gestational age here, not even quite halfway through development. But being able to go ahead and correct these. And there are a huge number of these things going on now. Here's another one where they've used stem cell transplants in utero. Again, starting at about 18 or 19 weeks gestational age. In this case, to correct a genetic problem, thalassemia. Little baby was born after being treated in utero, and it was mom's adult stem cells that they used. Baby's born without the condition. You can use adult stem cells, umbilical cord blood stem cells, also to treat born individuals. Here's just one example of, as I mentioned before, probably around 2 million or over 2 million now. Desiree had lived with sickle cell anemia, had an adult stem cell transplant, and for the first time in 20 years, was living without pain. She was able to go ahead and fulfill her dream of becoming a nurse so that she could start to help people who were suffering from her condition and others. Adult stem cells and umbilical cord blood stem cells, again, to actually create tissues. Here's strategies to use either iPS cells or adult stem cells, or cord blood, which I lump into adult stem cells, to start creating heart tissue, eventually even whole hearts, which they've been able to do now in the laboratory from human stem cells, so that a baby who has a congenital heart defect can be born and have either corrective surgery, a transplant, perhaps even one of those in utero surgeries. So there are a lot of uses, and a lot of uses made good on rather than just promises, using lots of sources of adult stem cells. As I mentioned, and this is an older paper where they were documenting over 1.5 million, but notice the paper was only looking up to about 2015. We're far beyond that now. Treating genetic conditions using genetic engineering of adult stem cells. Here's a recent paper and a story about a young man who had a condition called epidermolysis bullosa. It's a genetic problem where your skin basically falls off. It doesn't stick together because of a genetic problem in a certain connective protein. They took some of his adult stem cells and repaired that genetic problem in his cells. So now he's his own donor, but the genetic corrected cells were grafted back on. It shows a nice little picture here of some skin down in the lower right that they're growing in the lab, corrected genetically, transplanted back over his body, and he's living a normal life. And it turns out that over the last few years, iPS cells and adult stem cells have far surpassed embryonic stem cells. Most of the people, in fact, who originally were promoting embryonic stem cells now promote iPS cells. They're just easier to work with, and you don't have to worry about that little ethical problem of, hey, you have to kill a young human embryo to get the embryonic stem cells. It's patient-centered, especially the adult stem cells, as we mentioned, in terms of the transplants. We've put together a website you might want to go to sometime, Stem Cell Research Facts where instead of getting into all the geeky science, which I love to do, we let the patients just tell their stories, and a few of the doctors we let talk too, but just kind of go through how this was the real gold standard, especially in terms of transplantation. Remember that statute for fetal tissue? It was for transplantation, didn't pan out. Adult stem cells have definitely done that. There are other ways to make replacement cells and tissues. Direct reprogramming, probably haven't heard too much about this yet, but the idea that you can essentially turn one cell directly into another without going through a stem cell like IPS is kind of like you don't pass go, you just go directly to a new cell type. So turning a skin cell into a nerve cell or a brain cell or a heart cell or an insulin secreting cell. There are lots of experiments going on, not just in the lab, but preclinical studies to be able to do this to actually help people who have various types of diseases and conditions. We mentioned before fetal tissue for virus growth and vaccines, and nada in terms of fetal tissue. Again, no fetal tissue has ever been used, but there were some of these fetal cell lines. Back in the 60s, 70s, there are still a few fetal cell lines used for vaccine production, and we'll come back to that near the end. But in point of fact, most vaccines now, especially viral vaccines, are not using even these old fetal cell lines. All the current polio vaccines licensed in the US now use monkey cells, a cell line called Vero. Newer vaccines like the Ebola vaccine or the shingles vaccine aren't made with fetal cell lines. They're made with animal cell lines like CHO hamster cells or that Vero cell line. We mentioned fetal tissue for basic observational research and so on, and looking at these various aspects. And that does still go on. Here's a paper from 2014 where they were just looking at fetal lungs at different gestational ages to see, oh, I wonder when this enzyme starts to be produced. There's another one where they're actually using fetal kidneys transplanted into rats to try and steady tissue growth and so on. But again, fetal tissue is not the only game in town. Fetal tissue from, in this case, miscarried. In this case, it was spontaneously aborted, miscarried fetuses, gestational weeks at different ages to look at, can they get some cell lines started? Can they look at basic developmental biology? The induced pluripotent stem cells we've mentioned, I want to spend a little more time on some of their uses. Again, how they're made, the idea is you take just an ordinary cell, like a skin cell. You reprogram that cell using some genetic factors, and it turns it into an embryonic-like stem cell. Now, the more recent references I've seen is when they tried to do all these comparisons, even head to head, they can't tell a difference between IPS and embryonic stem cells. There's an ongoing debate about that, but it's primarily by those who want to continue embryonic stem cell research. But a lot of labs who used embryonic stem cells have switched to IPS cells. Best example, Jamie Thompson himself, Mr. Human Embryonic Stem Cell, who in 1998 was the first to successfully grow human embryonic stem cells, has switched his commercial lab completely over to IPS cells and made some statement about how it was great to be in on the beginning as well as the end of a field of research, meaning embryonic stem cells. The idea being you can use these to make different kinds of cells and tissues, maybe to do transplants, maybe to study the disease in the dish. There's some even more interesting things recently, making what are called organoids. The idea being that these cells will come together and start normal development in the lab dish to form different types of tissues and organs. So you can study the disease in the dish, not just with a layer of cells, but with actually small organs. Now, they don't all look like just a miniature version of an organ, but they have all of the characteristics in terms of the cell types and in terms of the functional interactions. One good example, kidney organoids, made from, again, iPS cells, where they were able to actually form all of the different cell types found in a normal kidney, steady its development, and it would even distill urine. It would work like a normal kidney. Cerebral organoids to model brain development, but also to look at things like microcephaly. And these were the ones made from iPS cells, not fetal tissue, that were able to discern how the Zika virus was causing the microcephaly in the infants whose mothers were infected with Zika virus. And it doesn't look like a brain, but you can see obviously a huge difference in size of these cerebral organoids without and with Zika virus infection. We keep mentioning humanized mice, and I labeled this fetal tissue for humanized mice, but then I listed only really one example that uses fetal tissue, the humanized immune system. These others we'll come back to in a minute. The idea here is you form a human immune system in a mouse so you can test drugs, you can test immunity, and so on. It's a good idea. The original humanized mouse was made in 1988 by Irv Weissman. They called it the Hugh Skid mouse. This is the more recent iteration, not palatable, BLT mice. BLT meaning they used bone marrow, liver, and thymus. This is why they were interested in that liver-thymus pair in the video that we watched. Liver provides hematopoietic stem cells for the use here. The thymus will train immune cells, human immune cells in the mice, and the bone marrow provides some other cell types. Before we look a little bit more at these mice, I want to remind you, though, where they're getting these cells and these tissues. These are the preferred ages, gestational ages, about 18 to 20, sometimes even a little later, weeks of gestation. So how do you make a BLT mouse? Well, you take a second trimester fetus and you take the liver, the bone and bone marrow, and the thymus. You transplant it into a neonatal mouse, and it's not just any neonatal mouse. They're genetic mutants that lack certain immune components. So you already have an empty shelf, if you will, to start putting the human immune system and the human immune cells in. These mice then do go on and they form a passable human immune system, but there are some problems with it. And one key problem I'd like to point out is you're forming a fetal human immune system. But wait, you're going to test drugs and chemicals and maybe vaccines that you hope to use on born human beings. So this isn't really the clinically relevant model that you want. And why liver for hematopoietic stem cells at the point where they're taking the tissues and organs at mid-gestation? The liver is where all of your hematopoietic stem cells are. You really don't have much in the way of bone marrow, just a tiny bit. So what about doing it without fetal tissue? Well, most humanized mice are made without using fetal tissue. That includes ones making a humanized immune system, and we'll look at a special example here in a minute, as well as things called the oncomouse. Now, oncomouse has now been trademarked as one particular type of mouse where they put a human cancer gene into the mouse and they can test different drugs and so on, chemotherapies against it. But generically, they've done this with lots of different individual or packages of human genes, cancer genes. A couple of examples used recently, the ACE2 mouse has the human ACE2 receptor. That's the one that SARS-CoV-2 virus binds to. So you can use this mouse, which you can buy from Jackson Laboratories commercially, to study COVID-19. We heard early in 2020, and then we've heard it again several times that, oh, we need fetal tissue so we can come up with ways to study and treat COVID-19. No, you don't. You've already got something, and it's actually better than making the humanized mouse with fetal tissue. Velocimmune mice are kind of a neat one. They actually engineered these mice using mouse embryonic stem cells that were then used to make mouse embryos, and these contain human antibody genes. And so if you're looking for an antibody against anything, you can go through and do a survey of these mice and be able to come up with an antibody. And actually, Regeneron has an antibody drug against the SARS-CoV-2 virus, FDA approved for emergency use. One of the two antibodies is made in their Velocimmune mouse. Geeky photo, how you can make these, injecting now instead of fetal tissue, fetal liver cells and whatever, peripheral blood stem cells or bone marrow adult stem cells of different types. Well, what about that thymus? Because they want to deliver thymus pair. They wanted hematopoietic and the thymus gland. Well, a few years ago, this group, which by the way includes Jamie Thompson, again, Mr. Human Embryonic Stem Cell, came up with this humanized mouse that uses neonatal, newborn tissue. They use umbilical cord blood as the source of the hematopoietic stem cells to actually make the various immune cells. But the thymus tissue comes from newborns. In particular, newborns who have had some sort of congenital heart problem that needs surgery. Turns out at that point in time, your thymus gland is huge. It occupies a huge amount of space up here just below your throat at the top of the chest. The pediatric cardiac surgeons trying to go in and work on that baby's heart, cut part or all of that thymus gland and throw it away just so they can get at the heart. It's not being obscured by it. There are 40,000 pediatric cardiac surgeries in the US per year. These guys found out you can make 50 times as many humanized mice per sample of neonatal tissue as you could from fetal tissue. It makes all the same cells, all the immune cells functional, just as good as that good old BLT mouse. And oh, by the way, it's more clinically relevant because now you've got tissue that has a more relevant born individual's immune system. A couple of other uses for the transgenic mice, the HH2 mice, being able to be used against SARS-CoV-2. And I think we're up to a break here.
Yeah, let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. And then I think we've got next on our schedule the related bioethical challenges. And then Ed's going to come back to the ethics discussion, and we'll have Q&A. Thanks so much for that, David. That's all very helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and start us on a 10-minute break. So if everyone could be back at 1:50 Central Time.